Okay, so the federal judiciary just dropped what might be one of the most explosive institutional power battles of Trump's second term. And Judge James Boasberg is standing right at the center of an absolute firestorm that's got Republicans calling for his head, the White House in full damage control mode, and Elon Musk lighting up social media with demands for impeachment. This isn't just about one ruling or one case. This is about a perfect storm of judicial confrontations that's threatening to blow up the entire relationship between the executive branch and the courts. And what makes this even more stunning is that all of this traces back to the same judge, the same judicial philosophy, and the same fundamental question: can the president simply ignore court orders when they get in his way? And right now, as we head toward the end of November 2025, this judge just restarted criminal contempt proceedings against Trump administration officials, who he says deliberately defied his orders earlier this year, while simultaneously facing multiple impeachment efforts from House Republicans, who are absolutely furious about revelations that he signed off on secret surveillance of Republican lawmakers. This is massive, this is messy, and this could fundamentally reshape how the three branches of government interact for decades to come. Now look, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this, because they're either going to bury the constitutional implications or turn it into partisan theater without explaining what's actually at stake. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening in Washington before everyone else figures it out, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth and isn't afraid to call out power when it oversteps. Alright, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Judge James Boasberg, the chief federal judge in Washington, D.C., just announced on November 19th that he's moving forward with criminal contempt proceedings against Trump administration officials over their actions back in March 2025. And this goes back to one of the most dramatic confrontations between Trump and the courts we've seen yet. On March 15th, Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, and 1798 wartime law that's only been used 3 times in American history during actual declared wars, to deport 252 Venezuelan migrants that his administration claimed were members of Tren de Aragua, a gang the government designated as a terrorist organization. The administration planned to send them directly to a notorious maximum security prison in El Salvador called CEQOT, basically a mega prison known for brutal conditions, without giving them any due process hearings or chance to challenge their deportation. The ACLU and other groups immediately sued, arguing this was unconstitutional, and the case landed on Boasberg's desk on a Saturday afternoon. During an emergency hearing that went into the evening, Boasberg issued a temporary restraining order blocking the deportations and explicitly ordered that any planes already in the air had to turn around and come back. He gave this order verbally at around 6 Central 4:05 p.m. and then put it in writing and filed it officially at 7:25 p.m. But here's where things went completely sideways. 3 planes carrying these migrants had either already taken off or were about to take off. And instead of turning those planes around as the judge ordered, the administration let them continue to El Salvador. All 252 people ended up in that prison, despite a federal court order saying they couldn't be deported. When Boasberg found out what happened, he was stunned. In court proceedings that followed, Justice Department lawyers refused to answer direct questions about whether they had complied with his order, citing national security concerns. They tried to argue that since his verbal order came at 64:45 and his written order wasn't filed until 7:25, there was some gray area about when exactly the order took effect and whether planes that were over international waters had to comply. Boasberg wasn't buying it. He called this argument a heck of a stretch, and in April issued a 46-page ruling finding probable cause that the Trump administration had willfully violated his court order and should be held in criminal contempt. Now, to understand why this is such a massive deal, you need to understand what criminal contempt means in this context. This isn't just about a judge being annoyed that someone didn't follow his ruling. Criminal contempt is one of the most powerful tools federal judges have to enforce their authority. It's based on a principle that's been fundamental to American law since 1789. When a judge issues an order, you have to follow it even if you think the order is wrong, even if you're appealing it, even if you think the judge doesn't have jurisdiction. You can play first, and you fight it through appeals. You don't just ignore it. Because if parties can simply disregard court orders they don't like, the entire judicial system collapses. Courts have no army, as James Madison famously pointed out in Federalist 78. They have no enforcement mechanism except people's willingness to respect their authority. So contempt power exists to make sure that willingness isn't optional. And what makes this case unprecedented is that Judge Boasberg isn't just talking about holding the government generally in contempt. He's talking about identifying specific administration officials, potentially hauling them into court to testify under oath, and potentially referring them for criminal prosecution. We're talking about potential fines, potential jail time for government officials who he believes deliberately defied a federal court order. This has never happened before at this scale with a sitting administration. And it gets worse. Because right after Boasberg issued his probable cause finding in April, the Trump administration immediately appealed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and a panel of judges put a hold on the contempt proceedings while they considered the case. For 7 months, this whole thing was frozen. The appeals court issued a complicated ruling in August that basically said Boasberg had overstepped in some ways, but they didn't completely shut down his contempt inquiry. Then the Trump administration asked the full appeals court, all 11 judges, to reconsider, and on November 14th, the full court declined to reinstate Boasberg's earlier finding of probable cause. But critically, they didn't stop him from continuing to investigate. They essentially said, "We're wiping away your probable cause finding, but you can still do fact-finding to figure out what happened." And that's exactly what Boasberg is now doing. In a hearing on November 19th, he told lawyers from both sides that he's moving forward immediately. He said justice requires him to act promptly, and he's planning evidentiary hearings that could start as soon as December 1st. He wants to hear testimony from at least 2 witnesses. One is a former Justice Department lawyer named Erez Riveni, who filed a whistleblower complaint earlier this year claiming that Emil Bove, who was the number 3 official at the Justice Department at the time and is now a federal appeals court judge himself, told colleagues in March that the administration might need to tell the courts to go screw themselves if judges tried to block deportations. Riveni also claims that Justice Department lawyers deliberately misled Boasberg about whether planes would take off in the next 24 to 48 hours. The other witness Boasberg wants to hear from is Drew Ensign, the DOJ lawyer who was arguing in front of him during that emergency hearing on March 15th. Ensign told Boasberg he was unaware if flights would take off soon, but Riveni's whistleblower complaint suggests Ensign knew planes were already departing or about to depart. So Boasberg is basically saying, I want to know exactly who made the decision to ignore my order when they made it what they knew, and why they thought they could do that. And depending on what he finds, he could refer specific individuals for criminal prosecution. The Justice Department is pushing back hard. Their lawyer, Tiberius Davis, argued at the November 19th hearing that there's no basis for contempt proceedings because the Supreme Court later vacated parts of Boasberg's original order. Davis's argument is essentially, look, the Supreme Court said your order was legally defective, so how can you hold people in contempt for violating an order that turned out to be invalid? But Boasberg's response is that it doesn't matter whether the order was later overturned. What matters is that at the time the administration had to comply, the order was in effect, and they chose to ignore it. The principle he's defending is that you can't just decide which court orders you want to follow based on whether you think you'll win on appeal later. That would turn the judicial system into a suggestion box instead of a binding authority. And this is where we start to see the much bigger institutional crisis brewing, because Trump responded to all of this by calling for Boasberg's impeachment. On March 18th, Trump posted on Truth Social that Boasberg is a radical left lunatic, a troublemaker and agitator, and should be impeached. He wrote in all caps that Boasberg didn't win any election, that Trump won with an overwhelming mandate to fight illegal immigration, and that judges like Boasberg are standing in the way of the will of the people. Trump wasn't the only one calling for impeachment. Elon Musk, who leads the Department of Government Efficiency and has basically become Trump's most visible ally, has been posting repeatedly on X that judges who block Trump's policies should be impeached immediately. Musk called it necessary to file impeachment articles against Boasberg and has said there needs to be a wave of judicial impeachments because judges are staging what he called a judicial coup against democracy. But wait, there's more. Because while all of this is unfolding, a completely separate scandal involving Judge Boasberg just exploded into public view, and it's this scandal that's driving a lot of the current impeachment push. In late October 2025, Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley released documents showing that during the Biden administration's investigation into January 6th and Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, an investigation code named Arctic Frost, Special Counsel Jack Smith's team issued 197 subpoenas seeking records on approximately 430 Republican individuals and entities. These subpoenas targeted phone records, banking information, donor lists, and communications metadata for prominent Republicans, including at least 10 senators, one House member, Trump family members like Jared Kushner and Lara Trump, and conservative organizations like the Republican National Committee and the Republican Attorneys General Association. And here's the kicker, Judge Boasberg signed off on all of these subpoenas. More than that, he signed non-disclosure orders, essentially gag orders, that prevented phone companies like Verizon and AT&T from telling these Republican lawmakers that their phone records had been subpoenaed. Verizon complied and turned over phone metadata covering several days in January 2021 for 12 phone numbers associated with Republican lawmakers. AT&T refused to comply, arguing the subpoenas raised constitutional concerns, but they were threatened with contempt. And what makes this particularly explosive is what Boasberg wrote in his non-disclosure orders. According to documents released by senators, including Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Marsha Blackburn, and Rick Scott, all of whom discovered their own phone records had been subpoenaed, Boasberg found that there were reasonable grounds to believe that if these senators were notified of the subpoenas, they might destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or jeopardize the investigation. Read that again. A federal judge signed an order saying he had reasonable grounds to believe that sitting United States senators would destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses if they found out their phone records were being subpoenaed as part of a grand jury investigation. Republicans are absolutely furious about this. Senator Cruz called it worse than Watergate and said Boasberg essentially printed these orders like placemats at Denny's, implying he just stamped whatever Jack Smith's team asked for without serious scrutiny. Cruz and other senators are arguing that these subpoenas violated the speech or debate clause of the Constitution, which protects members of Congress from being questioned or prosecuted for their legislative activities. They're saying this was an unconstitutional breach of separation of powers, that there was no legitimate law enforcement predicate for spying on members of Congress, and that the entire Arctic Frost investigation was a politically motivated witch hunt designed to intimidate Trump's allies heading into the 2024 election. And now they want Boasberg impeached for his role in authorizing the surveillance. On November 4th, Representative Brandon Gill of Texas filed articles of impeachment against Boasberg, specifically citing his role in the Arctic Frost investigation. Gill's resolution accuses Boasberg of weaponizing the judiciary against critics of the Biden administration, compromising judicial impartiality, and creating a constitutional crisis. Then on November 18th, 6 Republican senators led by Eric Schmidt, including Lindsey Graham, Mike Lee, Tommy Tuberville, Kevin Cramer, and Bill Hagerty, sent a letter to the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit Court calling for Boasberg to be administratively suspended from his duties pending formal impeachment proceedings in the House and a potential Senate trial. Let's break down what this actually means. First, understand that Boasberg isn't some random activist judge who came out of nowhere. He's a former federal prosecutor, played basketball at Yale, went to Yale Law School where he was roommates with Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and was appointed to the federal bench in 2011 by President Obama after being appointed to a D.C. trial court by President George W. Bush in 2001. He's cultivated a reputation as a principled, measured jurist with bipartisan respect. He's presided over dozens of January 6 cases and often issued sentences more lenient than what prosecutors recommended. He was the judge who handled sensitive grand jury disputes during the Mueller investigation. He served as presiding judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the secretive court that approves national security wiretaps, and in that role he actually criticized the FBI for errors in its surveillance during the Russia investigation. In other words, this is not some wild-eyed partisan, but Republicans now see him as the embodiment of what they call the weaponization of the justice system against conservatives. They look at his role in Arctic frost, his contempt proceedings over the deportation flights, and his general willingness to block Trump administration policies, and they see a pattern of judicial activism designed to thwart the elected president's agenda. Second, the impeachment calls are part of a much broader campaign by Trump and his allies to intimidate the federal judiciary. This isn't just about Boasberg. Multiple federal judges have blocked various Trump policies since he took office in January 2025. Judges have blocked his executive order ending birthright citizenship for children born in the U.S. to undocumented parents. They've blocked his order restricting gender, affirming health care for transgender minors. They've blocked his attempts to freeze federal funding to states and cities he considers uncooperative. They've blocked Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency team from accessing Treasury Department systems containing Americans' sensitive financial data. And in almost every case, Trump, Musk, or other administration allies have responded by calling for those judges to be impeached. Representative Derek Van Orden introduced articles of impeachment against Judge Paul Engelmayer, who blocked Doe Gee's Treasury access. Other House Republicans have filed or threatened to file impeachment articles against multiple judges. This isn't about one case or one judge anymore. This is about whether the Trump administration is going to accept judicial review as a legitimate check on executive power, or whether they're going to try to use impeachment as a political weapon to punish judges who rule against them. Third, this is prompting serious warnings from constitutional scholars and even from Chief Justice John Roberts. Roberts issued a rare public statement in March after Trump called for Boasberg's impeachment, saying, "For more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose." That's about as close as Roberts gets to publicly rebuking a sitting president. Legal experts are warning that if Congress starts impeaching judges simply for issuing rulings the majority party disagrees with, it would destroy judicial independence and turn the courts into political extensions of whichever party controls Congress. Impeachment of federal judges is supposed to be reserved for serious misconduct, corruption, criminal behavior, or gross ethical violations, not policy disagreements. Of the 15 federal judges who have been impeached in U.S. history, only 8 were actually convicted and removed by the Senate, and all of those cases involved allegations of serious wrongdoing like bribery, tax evasion, or perjury. None were impeached simply because Congress didn't like their rulings. If that norm breaks down, if judges start getting impeached over legal decisions, then judges will start ruling based on political pressure instead of law, and you no longer have an independent judiciary. Fourth, this raises the terrifying prospect of a genuine constitutional crisis where the executive branch simply refuses to comply with court orders. That's what the deportation case is fundamentally about. When Judge Boasberg ordered planes to turn around and the administration let them continue to El Salvador anyway, that was the first clear instance in Trump's second term of the White House openly defying a federal court order. The Justice Department tried to argue there was ambiguity about when exactly the order took effect, but Boasberg and legal experts aren't buying that. The real question is what happens if the executive branch just decides it doesn't have to follow judicial rulings. Courts have no enforcement mechanism. They can't send federal marshals to arrest the president or his cabinet officials without the cooperation of the executive branch itself. Federal judges can issue contempt orders, they can impose fines, They can theoretically jail people who violate their rulings, but all of that depends on the executive branch being willing to enforce those penalties. If the administration decides the courts have no power to constrain the president, then we're in genuinely uncharted and dangerous territory. Constitutional law professor Marin Levy of Duke University said the administration's actions and the threats against judges constitute direct threat to judicial independence. I want to intimidate another branch from performing its constitutional duty. Another legal scholar said we risk breakdown of the system if Congress refuses to check executive branch of the courts or the Corys and the left remaining alone. We're left alone. Fifth, this is all happening against the backdrop of the 2026 midterms, which are now less than a year away. Republicans currently control both the House and Senate, but their margins are slim, especially in the House. Democrats are watching these judicial battles, and they're going to make this a central campaign issue. They're going to argue that Trump is a threat to the rule of law, that he's trying to turn the judiciary into a rubber stamp, and that the only way to restore checks and balances is to flip Congress. Republicans, meanwhile, are going to argue that activist judges appointed by Democrats are thwarting the will of the people who elected Trump with a clear mandate to secure the border, cut government spending, and implement his agenda. They're going to say the courts have become an unelected, unaccountable obstacle to democracy, and that something has to give. Both sides are positioning this as an existential fight about the future of American governance, and voters are going to have to decide which argument they find more compelling. Sixth, there's a real question about whether the House will actually impeach Boasberg and whether the Senate would ever convict him. To impeach a judge, the House just needs a simple majority. Republicans have that, though their margin is narrow, and not every Republican is comfortable using impeachment as a political weapon. Speaker Mike Johnson would have to decide whether to bring impeachment articles to the floor, and so far House Republican leadership has seemed reluctant to go down this road, at least on the deportation case alone. But now with the Arctic frost revelations adding fuel to the fire, there's growing pressure from the Trump base and from AJ members of Congress to move forward. If the House does impeach Boasberg, the case would go to the Senate for trial, where a 2/3 majority would be required to convict and remove him from office. That means 67 senators. Republicans have 53 seats. They would need 14 Democrats to join them. That's not going to happen unless there's clear evidence of actual criminal misconduct or corruption, not just disagreements about legal rulings. So realistically, even if the House impeaches, Boasberg is probably not getting removed. But the impeachment itself would be damaging and unprecedented, and it would send a message to other federal judges that if they rule against Trump, they could face the same treatment. Seventh, Boasberg's contempt proceedings are moving forward regardless of the impeachment threats, and that creates a potential collision course. If Boasberg holds evidentiary hearings in December and determines that specific Trump administration officials should be held in criminal contempt and referred for prosecution, what happens then? The Justice Department, which is now run by Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi, would be the entity responsible for prosecuting those officials. But they're not going to prosecute their own colleagues for following orders to deport people the president wanted deported. So Boasberg has floated the idea of appointing a special independent prosecutor to handle the contempt case, someone outside the Justice Department's control. That would be extraordinary and legally murky. The Justice Department argues that prosecutorial power belongs exclusively to the executive branch and that a court can't just outsource it to a private citizen acting independently. They say that violates separation of powers and would create a dangerous precedent where judges could prosecute executive branch officials without any executive branch oversight. Even some legal scholars who support Boasberg's contempt inquiry are nervous about the idea of independent prosecutors appointed by judges going after administration officials. But Boasberg seems to believe that's the only way to enforce the rule of law if the executive branch won't police itself. Okay? Let's break down what this actually means across multiple dimensions, because this case is a microcosm of much larger institutional battles that are going to define American politics for years. First, On the immediate legal dimension, Boasberg is trying to establish that court orders are not suggestions and that government officials can't simply ignore them because they think they'll win on appeal or because they believe the president's authority overrides judicial rulings. If he succeeds in holding specific officials accountable through contempt proceedings, it would be a powerful reaffirmation of judicial authority. If he fails, or if his efforts are blocked by higher courts or by the administration's refusal to cooperate, it would signal that presidents can effectively ignore courts that get in their way, at least in high-stakes policy areas like immigration and national security. Second, on the institutional dimension, this is a fundamental test of whether the separation of powers still functions in a meaningful way. The framers of the Constitution designed a system where the three branches check each other. Congress writes laws, the executive enforces them, and the courts interpret them and can strike down actions that violate the Constitution. But that system only works if all three branches respect their roles and respect the authority of the other branches. If the executive decides judicial review is illegitimate when it blocks presidential priorities, and if Congress backs up the executive by impeaching judges who rule against the president, then we no longer have separation of powers. We have executive supremacy with legislative enablement. That's a very different form of government. Third, on the political dimension, this fight is mobilizing both bases ahead of 2026. Trump's supporters see an out of control judiciary trying to block an elected president from implementing the agenda voters gave him a mandate to pursue. They see judges like Boasberg as unelected bureaucrats in robes who think they can overrule the will of the people. They want Trump to fight back hard, and they're thrilled that he and Musk are calling for impeachments and refusing to back down. Trump's opponents see a would-be authoritarian trying to bulldoze the rule of law and intimidate anyone who stands in his way. They see the judicial branch as the last line of defense against executive overreach, and they're rallying around judges like Boasberg as heroes who are standing up to power at personal risk. Both narratives have emotional power, and both are going to drive turnout in the midterms. Fourth, on the international dimension, America's allies are watching this very closely. When a U.S. president openly defies court orders and calls for judges to be impeached, it undermines America's credibility when we lecture other countries about rule of law and democratic norms. How can the U.S. criticize authoritarian regimes for ignoring judicial decisions or attacking judges when we're doing the same thing here? European leaders, NATO allies, and partners in Asia are already nervous about Trump's unpredictability on trade, alliances, and foreign policy. Now they're seeing institutional chaos at home, and it makes them wonder whether the United States is a stable, reliable partner or a country in the middle of a constitutional crisis. That has real implications for American influence and for our ability to lead international coalitions on issues ranging from Ukraine to China to climate to technology regulation. Fifth, on the practical dimension, this fight is slowing down Trump's ability to implement his agenda. Every time a judge blocks one of his executive orders, it takes months or years to work through appeals. Even when he ultimately wins at the Supreme Court, the delay means the policy is frozen in the meantime. Trump is frustrated that he won the election, Republicans control Congress, but liberal judges appointed by Obama and Biden keep stopping him. He sees the judiciary as an unaccountable veto point that's making it impossible to govern. His critics would say that's exactly what the judiciary is supposed to do: slow down potentially unconstitutional actions and force the political branches to work within legal constraints. But the friction is undeniable, and it's creating real obstacles to policy implementation. Sixth, the Arctic frost revelations are adding a whole new layer of anger and mistrust. Republicans genuinely believe the Biden Justice Department used law enforcement powers to spy on Trump's allies for political purposes, and they see Judge Boasberg as a willing participant in that surveillance. They want accountability. They want people fired and prosecuted, and they see Boasberg's impeachment as part of that reckoning. Democrats in the Justice Department argue that Arctic frost was a legitimate criminal investigation into efforts to overturn the 2020 election, that the subpoenas for phone records were properly authorized by a judge as part of a grand jury investigation, and that if Republicans had nothing to hide, They shouldn't be complaining about lawful surveillance. But the non-disclosure orders are hard to defend. The idea that senators would destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses seems like a huge stretch, and it's hard to imagine a judge finding reasonable grounds for that conclusion, unless he was just deferring completely to whatever prosecutors asked for. So there's at least a colorable argument that Boasberg signed off on something he shouldn't have. Seventh, all of this is creating a dynamic where judges are under enormous pressure from both sides. Judges who rule against Trump are threatened with impeachment and face personal attacks from the president and his allies. Judges who rule in Trump's favor are accused by the left of being partisan hacks. It's becoming almost impossible to be a federal judge handling politically sensitive cases without half the country hating you. That's a terrible environment for judicial independence and for the quality of judging. Judges should be able to make decisions based on law and facts without worrying about political retribution. If we lose that, we lose something fundamental about what makes the American legal system work. So here's the bottom line. Judge James Boasberg has become the face of the institutional battle between Trump's second-term agenda and the federal judiciary's attempts to constrain executive power. His contempt proceedings against Trump officials over the deportation flights, his role in authorizing surveillance of Republican lawmakers during the Arctic Frost investigation, and his broader record of blocking Trump policies have made him a target for impeachment by House Republicans and a symbol of either principled resistance or judicial overreach, depending on your perspective. Over the next few weeks and months, we're going to see whether he actually holds administration officials in contempt and how the executive branch responds if he does. We're going to see whether the House moves forward with impeachment articles and how that plays politically. We're going to see whether other judges start backing down from confrontations with the White House because they don't want to face the same treatment Boasberg is getting. And we're going to see whether the Supreme Court steps in to clarify the limits of judicial authority and the obligations of the executive branch to comply with court orders. This is far more than a fight about one judge or one case. This is a fight about whether the United States still has a functioning system of checks and balances, or whether we're transitioning to a model where the elected branches can override judicial decisions they find inconvenient. It's about whether impeachment remains a tool for addressing genuine misconduct or becomes a weapon for punishing judges who make unpopular rulings. It's about whether contempt of court still has teeth, or whether powerful government officials can ignore judicial orders without consequences. And it's about whether the rule of law means the law applies equally to everyone, including the president, or whether it means the president's view of the law is what matters. Those are fundamental questions, and the answers we get over the next year could define American governance for a generation. Keep your eyes on this case. Watch how the contempt proceedings unfold. Watch whether the impeachment moves forward. Watch how other judges respond, and watch how voters react in 2026. Because this is not just a legal story. This is a story about power, accountability, and what kind of country we're going to be.